Hi, I'm Stephanie and this is my home, the 16th century Chateau de Lalande. Lalande was owned for hundreds of years by a family of marquises who were at the heart of French royal life. One of them even had the honour of being sent by King Louis XV to greet Marie Antoinette on her arrival in France. But, far from being a stuffy museum, this chateau is a living home. I live here all the time and am regularly joined by my mother, my family, my friends, and wonderful volunteers from all over the world who help me to lovingly restore this historic home. Welcome to Lalande, a chateau filled with life, love, and laughter. I'm so excited to be doing today's vlog because I'm going to be showing you all a hidden treasure in our local area, which is the church at Vic. This is a small village and this Romanesque church is hidden away in it and in fact contains frescoes that are important for the history of art around the world. Copies of the frescoes in this church can be found in museums in Paris and even in Japan. And in the museum in Japan, they're in the section of the museum that relates to frescoes through the centuries, and they are right next to the room containing copies of the Sistine chapel. So I'm about to show you the little Sistine chapel of Le Berry. Welcome to the Church of Saint Martin in Vic, where behind me you can see the second largest suite of Romanesque paintings in all of France. These are extraordinarily artistically important paintings. Only two parts of the church have paintings from the 1130s, and it would have been the case back then. Only these parts were painted. There's the painted rood screen, and then the chancel and the apse. The two areas have different themes. Imagine that you are a poor local peasant back in 1130 and you're coming to pray in your local church. The odds are you can't read, you can't write, the Mass is in Latin, but you do know the stories of the church. So this was the way of communicating the stories of the Bible to the congregation. It starts with the Annunciation, the Archangel Gabriel coming to announce to Mary that she is pregnant through Immaculate Conception. But there is a scene right next to her that's often left out these days, and that's the remonstrances to the Virgin, because it turned out Joseph was not that happy with Mary's explanation. I think that there are some questions asked, and next to the Annunciation you can see Mary being harangued by the church elders who are really checking, is she telling the truth? What's going on here? They didn't believe her at that point. And there's perhaps the most famous biblical story of them all, of course, the Nativity. You can see the three wise men arriving to worship the new Messiah, and above him there is the Star of Bethlehem. Below the Nativity is Christ's presentation at the temple, and you can see there's a big fortress-style building just above, which shows us that he was inside. This is going on in the temple. The final scene shows Jesus being taken down from the cross after his crucifixion. So in contemplation while sitting in this church, the congregation would have seen all of Christ's life from the annunciation of his birth to his death. The only other imagery on this wall is God himself, often shown in a lozenge-shaped almond, because that's his aura, the rays emanating from God. Below him, you can see the Lamb of God, which represents the sacrifice that he made for us all. And now we're going to do something that we wouldn't have been allowed to do in the 12th century. We're going to cross this threshold and just see. Everyone in the congregation would have known they were not allowed in here, but just in case they were going to forget it, on the base of the arch are two armed guards in full 12th century chainmail, reminding people this is a private, sanctified space. But people at the time would also have known that these soldiers were representing the allegorical poem, the Psychomachia by Prudentius, a Latin poet. His poem describes a huge battle between the 7 virtues and the 7 vices, and it was a very, very popular Christian epic at the time. After the simplistic chronological storytelling on the other side of this wall, In here, the theological themes get much more complex. There's a mixture of New Testament and Old Testament, because in here would have been the priests who would have had a much greater understanding of the Bible, and this was to speak directly to them.
It's believed that this church and its frescoes were commissioned by the monks of the Abbey de Deol. Deol was founded in 917 and became one of the most powerful abbeys in France during the Middle Ages. And those monks would probably have been the ones to choose which theological themes would be picked out in these paintings. It's extraordinary that that huge, powerful monastery now lies in ruins, but this small church that they commissioned is still in such a beautiful state today.
This church is the Church of Saint Martin, and Martin is rather a local saint who lived in Tours, not far from here. And the scene at the top of this wall shows his death. His body is being guarded over by monks, but a close look at the monks show you that they're rather falling asleep and they're not paying attention. So you can see his body being stolen and passed through a window and taken away, because in medieval times, the bodies of saints were extremely valuable. They effectively started the tourism industry. People travelled to see relics of saints. So any town that could get hold of the relic of a saint would have an influx of visitors, and it would help commerce, it would help the whole town. And this shows exactly what would happen in those days as saints' bodies were actually stolen. This part of the church is surrounded by the prophets. Here I have David to one side of me and Moses to the other. All four apostles around God in the apse, and different orders of the angels. Here there is a magnificent seraphim, and if you look closely, you can see that he has 3 sets of wings. There were many different types of angels, and they were all ordered by rank. The seraphim had 3 sets of wings because they would appear directly before God. One set was to shield their bodies for modesty. Another set, of course, was for flying, very important for an angel. And the third set was to cover their faces respectfully when they were in God's presence.
At the top of the wall to the right of the seraphim, there is a scene from the Old Testament where a seraphim comes down and purifies the lips of Isaiah. He places a burning coal against his lips and says, "Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out." Immediately to the left of that scene is a depiction of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem.
Many of you, when thinking about Romanesque art, might imagine very, very still images, because that really was the style at the time. But the incredible mastery here is that the artist of Vic was able to really capture movement. There is so much movement in these paintings. It's as though they're alive. If you see the moment behind me, it's Judas's kiss. He's pointing out Christ. There are soldiers jostling in the background. Judas is reaching forward and grabbing Christ, who's looking back as he's already being dragged away. The movement is extraordinary. Above me is a universally recognizable scene. It's, of course, the Last Supper. But if you look closely, you'll see that Judas, who's in the front right and is crouching down in front of the table, has as though a gust of wind pushing up his robes. But that represents the spirit of evil entering his body.
This is my favourite bit so far here.
This bit?
Yeah, and I don't know why, because you can see there's a lot of blue here, but then there's also, you can pick out this green and the yellow. I don't know, this little face here just appeals to me.
I love the way you see it with an artist's eye.
And then just above here, you've got these little waves.
Oh, yes.
Can you see the waves of the sea? Absolutely beautiful. And to think this was painted 900 years ago, and it's still here.
And they think by one artist.
One artist. Must have taken him a long time, because I've painted a mural before, and they're a lot of work. A lot of work. And years ago, they wouldn't have had, paints from a shop in little tubes and pre-made paintbrushes. They would have had to have ground up the minerals and mixed them with oils or whatever and made their own paints. So if you run out of paint, you have to mix up more and keep making it. And they probably would have had to have made their own brushes as well.
All of the depth and complexity of these murals are achieved using only 4 pigments: charcoal for the black, red ochre, yellow ochre, and lime white. And just mixing those together gave the artist all of these possibilities. Here you can also see part of the decoration, which is this series of a faux fabric being draped around the altar. And back at the chapel at Lalonde, you'll see the 19th century version of this, the copy of this earlier way of doing it. Here you're seeing the original. These murals are perhaps so well preserved because they would only have been visible for maybe about 100 or 200 years, because in the 13th century the church was redecorated, and you can see that here. This is the thickness of the extra plaster that was added, and here is the new 13th century decoration. And the church stayed like this until the 1840s, when the local priest saw an area of plaster fall off and realised that there was an older fresco underneath. So he went to see Georges Sand, who was living nearby in her chateau. She was a very famous local writer, more famous outside France as being Chopin's lover, but in France she's extremely famous as one of the big figures in the Romantic movement here. She immediately came to the church with her son and lots of her friends who were artists, and they realised the importance of what they found here. They put scaffolding up and they chipped away all of the old plaster, and gradually this fresco appeared. Thinking about it, that was a bit of a shocking way of doing it. Nowadays it would be a team of restoration specialists taking years removing the plaster with a scalpel. It happened a lot faster then, but they did manage to achieve something remarkable. She went straight to Paris and saw Prosper Mérimée, who was in charge of cultural heritage for the government, and she managed to have this listed as a historical monument right back then in the 1840s. I've arranged to meet Annick Dussault here. She is absolutely passionate about this church, and she is in charge of raising funds for its restoration. She's the attachée from the local heritage department.
Pour les fresques, en fait, on va surtout toucher le moins possible, mais il y a quand même besoin, parce qu'on voit à certains endroits la couche picturale se décolle. Vous voyez ici, là c'est en train de s'abîmer, c'est en train de s'écailler et de tomber. Donc si on n'arrête pas ça, bah, effectivement petit à petit ça va tout...
The really interesting thing about this fresco is you will look at that and you'll think that has been there for 900 years like the rest of them. But that's not true, because what happened in the 1930s is that these pieces of artwork on the walls were very, very badly damaged and they were falling off. So obviously you would have had all of these little flakes of plaster. So to save them, what they did is they took off this entire piece of art here, this piece of fresco. They took it off and they fused it to a canvas. And they must have taken this off in such a very, very thin layer, because the canvas is actually visible through the fresco in places, so they must have taken this off in wafer thin pieces. Something really interesting that you can see is just here and here is visible a piece of old newspaper from the 1930s that they would have used to attach this to. So I'm assuming they would have laid the flakes of plaster with the painting onto a piece of newspaper, glued them to it, and then they would have glued that to a canvas. And then what they did is they took that piece of canvas and then they put it back onto the wall so that it was all consolidated. But you can see here that some of the original artwork that was attached to the canvas is now coming off. So this is going to need some restoration. Another thing you can see is here, these nails. So what they would have done is the canvas, once it was ready to go on the wall, they would have actually nailed it into the plaster. And they would never do that now because these nails could rust, and obviously that would cause staining. And that is one of the old methods of restoration for these. Obviously the modern restoration methods would not have done that. They wouldn't have taken it off. They would have consolidated it a different way. If they hadn't have done that in the 1930s, this beautiful fresco, including the seraphim above my head, would not be here anymore. So that is why restoration of these buildings and conservation is incredibly important.
Alors c'est un travail particulièrement délicat qui sera mené par des entreprises très spécialisées, c'est-à-dire qu'ils vont par exemple injecter avec des seringues des produits pour recoller au mur. On a la souscription qu'on a lancée, on s'est donné comme objectif quelque chose comme 40 000 €, donc on en est encore assez loin. On a besoin que tout le monde participe pour qu'on puisse mener ça vraiment jusqu'au bout.
Pour arriver à 40 000 €.
40 000 euros, voilà.
40,000 euros is not a lot to add to this, to preserve it, to fix it back onto the walls so that it doesn't drop off and save it for another at least 100 years. It's the Sistine Chapel of France, much older as well.
Non, non,
Quelle
c'est-
chance on a d'avoir ça dans notre région.
Ah oui, bah oui, c'est pour ça que moi je voudrais bien le faire plus connaître parce que c'est vraiment un trésor, hein, c'est vraiment un trésor.
C'est très important. This project is really important to both of us, and we're both going to be donating today to try to save this church.
Yes, and obviously because this is in your local area, it's something of huge historical significance. And me, as an artist, I've just got so much appreciation for the beauty in this and the history behind it as well. And the fact that after 900 years, it's still here. And that is because in the last couple of 100 years, people have been taking care of it. And it's really important that people continue to do that.
And one of the extraordinary things about it, if any of you come to this region to visit, we have the heavens with us, is that look how empty it is. It's open every day from 9 until 7, and people can just let themselves in and sit and contemplate alone here, surrounded by these treasures, these artistic treasures of France, and we're so lucky.
I had no idea this was here, and I had no idea that you could go and view 900-year-old frescoes
For free.
for free. And I just can't believe it. I think they're so well preserved as well. It's unbelievable. And you can picture it as it was by looking at it. It just would have been wonderful, and it still is.
So anything we can do to help, we want to do. And we're going to put a link in the description below. And if any of you would like to donate to help this building, they will be putting the names of everyone who donates on a plaque that will be in the church. So if you want to be part of the history of this church, then please follow that link below.
And if any of you would love to help with the renovation of this church but just don't have the funds to send any money, don't worry, you can help by watching any of the adverts on this video, because all of the ad revenue from this video will be going towards the restoration of the Church of St. Martin in Vic. I've already made a preemptive donation of 500 euros from us all, and anything more that we make beyond that will also be sent to the foundation.